Good morning, everyone. Today we're joined by Lena Orlin, professor in our Department of English, a renowned scholar of Shakespeare. She previously served as the executive director of the Folger Institute and as the executive director of the Shakespeare Association of America. And she joined our Georgetown community in 2007. So Lena, thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning for this conversation. Let's jump right in. As I shared, your scholarship focuses on Shakespeare's life and writings and extends into broader Elizabethan England. As we begin, could you share a little bit about how you came to be interested in Shakespeare and the kinds of questions that have animated your scholarship?
Well, I wonder if it wasn't just the way you got into research and scholarship and higher education, which is good teachers. I didn't grow up with Shakespeare, but I grew up reading a lot. I was never the kind of person who needed to see myself in what I was reading, because what I liked about reading was that I was learning that there were different lives than the life I was living and different ways of being than the way that I grew up with. But I think I did need to see something in my teachers. And that wasn't necessarily that I had to have women teachers, for example. All the people who really influenced me were men. Undergraduate, a man named David Young, William Carroll at graduate school, Lawrence Avery, Alan Dussin. But these were men who shared a sense that that girls were worth teaching. And I think that that's what I needed from my teachers. When I was in graduate school, a good friend of mine decided that she wanted to specialize, in medieval literature. And she went to a very distinguished medievalist and asked if he would direct her dissertation. And he looked at her and said, "Aren't you married?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Shouldn't you be home making curtains?" You know, it was a different time. In any case, I was lucky to have teachers who weren't asking me that kind of question and who thought it was worth educating girls. And these happened to be people who were interested in Shakespeare, and I was interested in how lively their engagement was with Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is so big because you can talk about poetry, you can talk about theater, you can talk about history. There are a lot of different ways of approaching Shakespeare, and I've come at him from different directions at different points in my life. But in my research and my publications, I've usually come back to history and back to that original interest in understanding how other people live. It's just that the people that I happen to be interested in were from Shakespeare's time in Elizabethan England. And I'm especially interested in how ordinary people lived. You know, people who weren't as famous as Shakespeare, but who were living the same time as he.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Now, in addition to your previous service at the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Shakespeare Association of America, you're a trustee of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. Could you reflect on the importance of archival research and what's made possible by having access to primary documents, especially in his birthplace, his hometown?
The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is a great resource, let me say. The interest in Shakespeare is so long-lived that people started collecting documents about Shakespeare within the century after he died, and they were assembled in Stratford. So throughout England, there are county record offices. Every county has a record office for documents that originated there. Stratford is the kind of unique exception of a town that's essentially a county record office unto itself, just because of the interest in Shakespeare. And, you know, as I said, Shakespeare can be poetry, Shakespeare can represent theater, but he's also great stories. And what I find in the archives is great stories and unknown stories. And I started probably when I came across a kind of a record class, which included documents from what were called church courts in Elizabethan England. Their legal system was organized differently from ours, but the church had its own court system, and it had a certain jurisdiction, which had to do with sexual infidelity, with broken marriages, with sexual slander, with the validity of wills. That is, with everything that the church intersected with kind of like birth, baptisms, churches, weddings, death, burials, the things that the church was responsible for. And what this church court did, the way in which it proceeded, was to take down the verbatim oral testimony of witnesses who came into the court. And it was through these cases that I encountered the voices of blacksmiths and farmhands and maidservants, and all of them telling wonderful stories and leaking information about how they lived and how they engaged with their homes and what possessions they cared about and how they related to members of their family and to members, other people in town. And, you know, I just have always been kind of fascinated by what I found there. Although the research is historical, I was trained in literature. And so I've tried to treat these documents with the techniques that I learned as a literary scholar, which involves close reading. And I've particularly been interested in trying to understand how the documents are shaped or constrained by the institutions that produce them, by the conventions, by their vocabularies. When people write about Shakespeare, they usually look at 40 or 50 key documents from his life, and they look at a single document kind of abstracted from its context and don't always understand that context, which leads to misunderstandings. So I've tried to read other cases, read around it. If I could give you one example.
Sure.
So probably the most famous line out of Shakespeare is "to be or not to be" from Hamlet. But the most famous line out of his personal life is probably the fact that he left his wife his second best bed in his will. This is something that gets quoted a lot, presumably as an insult to his wife, that he left her nothing but an old bed. But I started reading a lot of wills from the period, and I found that it's very common to give a second best bed, and it's never given with animus. It's never an insult. It's just a way of identifying one bed as distinct from another. And so it provided a different frame onto his personal life in order to see that document within the context of other like documents. And what the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust has allowed me to do in terms of looking at documents from Stratford is also to read about other people who lived in the town who happen to have been better documented than Shakespeare, but who lived comparable lives and who give us a kind of way of understanding through analogy or through comparison what we might think about his life. And what we might think about how he was relating to people and how he thought of his house and his possessions and so on.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Now, later this month, you'll present the annual Shakespeare Birthday Lecture in Stratford. And at the lecture, you're going to present groundbreaking research around the effigy bust in Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare is buried. Could you share a little bit about what you've discovered and the significance of these findings for our understanding of William Shakespeare?
Yeah, I wish I could show you a picture. It's really a remarkable monument and pretty unusual, actually. It's a kind of full-size figure of Shakespeare down to his waist. So it shows the upper half. He's standing and writing, holding a quill in one hand and a piece of paper in the other, in a kind of architectural niche. When he was buried in 1616, there were thousands of people who did not have monuments. There were thousands of people who did not have gravestones. There were lots of people who were very rich and very influential, who had the kind of monument that we think of as medieval, where you have like two full figures laid out on a tomb chest. There were people who showed themselves on plaques where they were kneeling in prayer. There were hundreds of those. And then there are only 100, 150 maybe examples of this kind of half-height figure that Shakespeare was. A man named Nicholas Pesner traveled around England, went to every church, and started keeping track of monuments and in these churches. And he noticed the Shakespeare type of monument. He knew that it was unusual. He associated it with ecclesiastics, with clergymen, and with divines. But one thing he didn't notice, which is what I have been working on, is a particular feature of Shakespeare's monument that could otherwise be seen only in monuments at Oxford University. Now, these are the things that I deduced from this. First, although people have always said about Shakespeare that he unfortunately missed out having a university education. In fact, I think he did participate in university culture. He worked in London, which is where the public theaters were. His family was in Stratford. He went back and forth once or twice a year. And the place where he stayed overnight was Oxford. And I think he wasn't just staying overnight. I think the fact that he saw these model monuments of people at Oxford means that he was listening to lectures and sermons delivered in Oxford University and hearing from the most learned men of the day. So that's one thing, which has to do with a kind of witness to his lifelong learning. A second thing is, because he was the only one who was going, and his family going back and forth, I think that he commissioned the monument himself. It was very common for people actually to organize their monuments before they died. And then thirdly, I think he probably, the evidences are that he met the man who did the sculpture, that half-height sculpture of him, which would mean that it's the only life portrait we have of Shakespeare. So I think the monument shows us how he looked. And I also think it shows us how he wanted to look, which is he wanted to be remembered with his quill in hand and with his sheet of paper, but looking out at his audience, because as I said, he was an actor as well as a writer.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Now you have a forthcoming book, The Private Life of William Shakespeare, which also focuses on the effigy bust at Holy Trinity Church. Can you talk about the project, what inspired the work? And you've said that in that time that you've been working on this biography, about 10 other biographies have been published. So what are some of the key ideas and questions that you're exploring in this book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm often embarrassed to tell people that I'm working on a Shakespeare biography because there's so many of them, and it's probably more than 10 now. I mean, they exhaust, but the interest seems to be kind of inexhaustible. With one exception that I can think of, they're all literary biographies, and what I'm doing is not a literary biography. So the usual method is to try to connect Shakespeare, what we know about Shakespeare's life, to what he wrote in the plays. I decided not to do that. And in fact, my ambition with this book was never to mention a play or a poem, which of course sounds kind of, contradictory, because why else would we be interested in Shakespeare anyway? But I'll tell you again, if I may, why. So there's this long history of people imagining that Shakespeare had a very antagonistic, unhappy relationship with his wife, which has to do not only with the second best bed, but with the fact that she was 8 years older than he, that she was pregnant when they got married, that looks then like a shotgun wedding, that as soon as they got married, he ran away to London so he could have an independent career there, and that at the end of his life, he still despised her when he gave her that second best bed. That's the kind of standing story. And one of the ways in which people, one of the kinds of evidence people give for this story, it also comes from the literature. So they quote a character named Orsino in the play Twelfth Night, who kind of offhandedly says, "Let still a woman take an elder than herself." That is, in a relationship, the man should be older. And they say, how could Shakespeare possibly have written that if he didn't believe that he would have been happier if he'd been with a younger woman? What I would say is, has anybody read Othello? A play where Othello often talks, when a character, we're repeatedly reminded that Desdemona is a lot younger than Othello, and that doesn't turn out to be such a happy marriage. Othello kills Desdemona. So I tend to think that you can prove anything you want to think in Shakespeare's plays, and I also think one of my premises is that Shakespeare's smarter than I am, and that I'm not the one who's smart enough to figure out when he's writing autobiographically, if he's writing autobiographically. And personally, I don't think he writes autobiographically.
Got it.
Another of my premises is that I don't think his life was as hapless as people have thought, the shotgun wedding and all that. I think he designed the life that he wanted to live. I think he was smart enough in that part of his life too, to figure out what he wanted. And I don't know that what he wanted out of his marriage was a romantic relationship. I don't know that was what the emotional state of their relationship was, but I do think that the partnership served him. It was a working partnership. He had the life he wanted. He got out of Stratford. He went to London. He was an actor. He was a playwright. He made enough money to buy property. He could retire at the end of his life with a good income from that property. He became a gentleman. I think that, you know, he had pretty much the life he wanted. It was another testimony to his intelligence, I think, which I would want us to acknowledge. And the monument, to my mind, is part of that in terms of the life that he put together. He was designing what he wanted.
Got it. Now, in your teaching and in your work, what has it meant to share new ways of engaging with Shakespeare's work with those who are new to reading Shakespeare? Are students today reading and engaging with Shakespeare in different ways than when you were first entering your field?
You know, probably the most surprising thing is how many students are still interested and still engage with Shakespeare enthusiastically. We talk about very different things. Obviously, we ask very different questions than we used to, so that we talk about gender, about sexuality in Shakespeare, about race, about ethnicity, about ecology, about incarceration, about disability, about privilege, about power. I mean, you know, from my point of view, Shakespeare meets us wherever we are. And so students can take all kinds of questions to Shakespeare and find things there. I think that for me, the biggest difference across the time I've been teaching has been the increasing availability of video versions of Shakespeare. We have not only films, you know, born film versions of Shakespeare, but we have video captures of theatrical productions, which are wonderful to work with. The language of Shakespeare is difficult. It's always going to be difficult, but it's so much easier when you have a good actor helping you understand what a line means through intonation, emphasis, pausing, phrasing, and so on. And I find the interpretations of actors and directors at least as interesting, if not more so, than literary criticism a lot of the time. And what I particularly like is when we have more than one version of a play, we can put up two or three versions of a scene and show how different it can be depending upon the choices that the actors and directors make. So there's so much room for anybody to bring his or her own interpretation to Shakespeare. There are just so many variables in terms of what the costumes look like. To whom do I direct this speech? Is it a question or a statement? I mean, things can go in so many different directions. And so there's just always room for you to bring your own interests and questions and interpretations to Shakespeare.
Sure.
My mind.
Sure. Great. And can you reflect on some of the significant moments you've experienced in your career, the changes you've seen in Shakespearean scholarship during this time, and where do you see the field going next?
Well, a lot of it, as I said, I mean, it has to do with what we're interested in the moment and what we take to Shakespeare. So that feminist criticism, 1980 kind of Shakespeare criticism blew open with theory, with what was called New Historicism, with feminism. And, it's gone through cycles, actually, as new interests have come up. I think that one of the things that I've especially appreciated is how international Shakespeare is. I've been lucky to meet Shakespeareans from Britain, obviously, but most countries in Europe, China, Japan, Singapore, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, Russia, Turkey, Israel, South Africa. There are Shakespeareans everywhere, and we kind of have a universal passport in terms of meeting and enjoying a shared language. And then obviously Shakespeare is our opening to talk about a lot of other things as well. he's also a shared language, I think, in this country. So one of the things that I found particularly moving was from last summer during the Black Lives Matter protests in Lafayette Square. A journalist interviewed a woman named Jennifer Jones, who said, when she was talking to the journalist, "If you cut me, I bleed." You know, she's quoting Shakespeare. That's from The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock says, you know, "Hath not a Jew eyes? If you cut me, if you prick me, do I not bleed?" And Jennifer Jones went on to say, "I want you to know I'm bleeding here." And I think how useful Shakespeare is to so many of us to find a common language and to go past his language in new directions. And I hope that he stays a kind of useful resource to help us understand each other and human experience.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you. Thank you for taking this time to share your reflections with us. As we bring our conversation to a close, is there a message you'd like to share with our Georgetown community?
When you finish a book, which I've just done, one of the last things you do is write acknowledgements. And usually what I've done in acknowledgements is to thank individuals, to thank people. And this time I found myself thinking much more about institutions, about the infrastructure of research and scholarship, the colleges, the universities, the libraries, the archives, the publishers, the conferences, the lecture series, and all the people who staff it all, the teachers, the administrators, the librarians, the curators, the digital engineers, the archivists, the editors. I'm just hoping that amidst all the pressures that we all face now, that these great infrastructures which have been built across centuries survive and thrive. And I'm very grateful to you, Jack, and to your team for the continued commitment to research and to scholarship and to education and to social justice and to what Georgetown represents.
You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you. And
Thank
again,
you.
thank you for taking this time, and thank you for all of your incredible contributions to our university community. And congratulations again on the lecture later this month at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Lecture, and on your new book. It has been an honor. It's been an honor to spend this time with you, and I wish you the very best. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all the very best. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you, for every Hoya, everywhere.